and good evening again, everyone. I hope you all had a good week. So yeah, as Sylvia mentioned, we're going to look at the fourth chapter of this encyclical this evening, and I'll speak for 25 minutes, half an hour maybe, just some of my own observations and reflections and insights into this chapter. But more importantly, it's good for us to hear each other speaking, and we always have in the group, I think, a great wealth of experience and talent. So there'll be enough time, hopefully, for everyone to make their comments or offer their insights into this fourth chapter. Just to recap, the early part of the encyclical, the first chapter or so, we heard Francis map out, if you like, the scale of the problem globally. He kind of sets out his stall in that early section of the encyclical. He points to a number of different issues that are very pressing, and that he then moves on into as the encyclical unfolds. And in chapter 2, we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan and unpacked that a little bit and looked at perhaps the moral messages, the many moral messages that we could extract from that parable. And ultimately, I suppose it's a message of hope, as well as a message of realism, as well as being a challenge to us to be able to respond when we can, according to our talents and our time and our resources, to whatever the issue is that's in front of us. And then last week, we looked at the third chapter, and I said to you that arguably this is where Francis outlines his vision for a better world, a more equitable and a more just and a more fair world. And there's what would you say? Somebody once described this encyclical almost as kind of his psychology. There's a psychology in what he's saying. He's not looking at the issues and the solutions, so to speak, simply in a practical way. He wants to look at it through the lens of our Christian anthropology. He wants to look at things in this encyclical and elsewhere from the perspective of the person and the human crisis that's driving many of the injustices we see around us. So he provides us with a vision, if you like, in that third chapter, and we looked a little bit at that last week. Here in chapter 4 of the encyclical, you could argue, and how I'm going to sort of set it up, is that he's really trying to tease out some of the tensions then that exist. Okay, so the complexity of the problem, the complexity of our world, the solutions to the kinds of issues that Francis is dealing with here are not easy, and they're not straightforward. And there are very real tensions that can exist in our lives and in our societies and more globally. And some of that is kind of what he's trying to look at here in this fourth chapter, if you like. So again, there's a strong sense of realism here. This isn't the Holy Father just presenting a lovely flowery picture of things or nice ideas and nice language, and we can all go away feeling a little bit better about ourselves. This chapter, for me at least, is kind of deeply rooted in a realism. And these tensions that are real in ourselves and in our relationships, these are not things that Francis is trying to shy away from. So I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. But just to begin, arguably, this is my take on it, not everyone will agree with this, but arguably one of the most important sentences in this fourth chapter is found in paragraph 128. And I'll read it out for you. If the conviction that all human beings are brothers and sisters is not to remain an abstract idea, but to find concrete embodiment, then numerous related issues emerge, forcing us to see in a new light and to develop new responses. Now for me, that's a really important sentence. If the conviction that all human beings are brothers and sisters is not to remain an abstract idea. Okay, one of the most fundamental Christian beliefs is that all human beings are made in the image and in the likeness of God. We don't profess that all white people are made in the image and likeness of God, or all Christians or all Catholics are made in the image and likeness of God, or all straight people or all economically wealthy people. We believe that all human beings are made in the image and in the likeness of God. And because of that, we believe that there's an inherent dignity in all human beings. And that dignity is not dependent upon race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or nationality or economic status. It's not derived from merit. It's not something we earn. It belongs to us simply because we are human and for no other reason. Now, this is something that we in the Christian tradition profess and believe. And it's one of these things that sounds lovely, right? But it is an incredibly challenging theological and ethical statement, because that places incredible demands on us as committed Christians in the world. It's a very inconvenient theological statement. It's a burdensome and a taxing theological statement. And it means, therefore, that we have responsibilities, as we saw in the second chapter with the parable of the Good Samaritan. We have responsibilities to all people around us, not just the men of my own stock, as Kipling put it, not just the people who look like me or the people whom I like and I enjoy being around. So we flow out from that very fundamental theological statement to then having to explore and unpack the implications of that and the meaning of that in a practical way that is rooted and situated in the here and now. It carries with it responsibilities in the here and now. And we're obliged to then move out and try to create a better world and a fairer world and a more inclusive world, because we believe in this statement about the human person and about our relationship with God. So that's a really important sentence. And as I said, it's a very inconvenient sentence that Francis begins this chapter with. And we can think of, for example, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and in the ministry and public life of Jesus, if we think of who it was that Jesus most often condemns, it's the hypocrites. It's not the adulterers or the tax collectors or people who are sick and all of this kind of thing. He condemns people who are hypocrites. In the kind of ancient meaning of it, a hypocrite is somebody who wears a mask or wears a false face. So you say one thing, but you do something very different. And again, this is part of what's coming out in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's that attitude and mentality and hypocrisy or inconsistency, if you want to call it that, that Jesus is critiquing through this parable, among other things. So what Francis is doing here, I think, in this early section of the chapter, he's calling us to be people who are theologically and ethically consistent. We're not called to be hypocrites or to be inconsistent in our approach and in our ideology and in our beliefs. We're called to be theologically and ethically consistent. And that's really, really tough. It's very difficult sometimes to be nice to people who are very unpleasant and selfish and greedy and all the rest of it. And that's just a very kind of obvious thing to say. But we're called to be people who are theologically and ethically consistent. And that means being people and being a church and being a people of faith who will be, if you like, countercultural in the way that Jesus was countercultural in the New Testament. We're called to critique and to confront the double standards around us, the injustices around us, and so on and so forth. So from there, Francis then goes on to look at, if you like, some of the implications of this theological statement, that all human beings have an innate dignity and that all human beings are made in God's image. And he begins by speaking about immigrants. And he makes a very obvious but very important observation. He says, ideally, unnecessary migration ought to be avoided. If you think of the many millions of people around our world who are displaced, I think it's probably fair to say that the vast majority, if not all of them, do not want to be displaced. They have been forced out of their homes. They have not they didn't choose to leave in a kind of a free sense. They had to leave because they were fleeing war or violence or human rights abuses or economic destitution. Francis is here echoing a point that Paul VI made in Populorum Progressio, when Paul offered us his great kind of vision of what integral human development would look like. And in Populorum Progressio, Paul makes the point that peace is not just the absence of war. Peace is about having the right social conditions which enable human flourishing to happen, which will protect and foster the rights of people, inclusivity, foster the common good, and so on. And that if you don't have those fundamental building blocks in a society, you will not have a lasting peace. So Francis is sort of echoing that idea here. And he says that we have to, he says, create in countries of origin the conditions necessary for a dignified life and for integral development. And if we in the West, for example, are part of a problem that won't allow for people in other parts of the world to live a dignified life, we haven't the right to then be giving out when those people turn up on our doorstep looking for a better life and a better chance at their dignity being protected and so on. And he offers 4 words. I think this is a very helpful part of this early section. He offers 4 words, he says, when welcoming the stranger: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. And when we, again, think of the parable of the Good Samaritan, we probably think of the first word there most often: welcome. Are we willing to welcome the stranger or the displaced or the marginalized or the hurt? But it's more than that. We have to protect those who are vulnerable and marginalized in our communities and in our world. We have to promote their dignity and the rights of all people and so on. And we have to make sure that people are integrated in society. And that's not just the stranger coming in. It may be those who are among us already. So it might be the traveler community, for example, or whoever it is. So there, I think, 4 helpful words that get us thinking, at least, about what our moral response and moral obligation might be. And he says in paragraph 129, undertaking a journey together through these 4 actions in order to build cities and countries that are open to difference and know how to promote them in a spirit of human fraternity. So I like that because he talks about journeying together. And he talks about being open to difference and how we can promote the welfare and the good of people in a spirit of human fraternity. He then moves on a little bit later into this chapter. He goes on to speak about the benefits of welcoming the stranger. So having set the thing up, okay, immigrants are a particular group of people who are worthy and who need our response, sort of thing. He then talks about the benefits of this. What's in it for me, sort of thing. And you hear this argument a lot in public debates around, our responsibilities to refugees or migrants and so on. Maybe not even public debates, it could be within our families or within our workplaces. But you'll hear people ask the question, well, like, why does Ireland have to do anything? We didn't start the war in Syria, for example. It's nothing to do with us. We have our own problems at home. Why should we be bothered doing anything for a people whom we don't know and to deal with a problem that was not of our creating? That sort of argument. In a way, Francis is trying to answer those sentiments here. He talks about the reciprocal gifts that each side receives, so to speak, through this, again, human encounter, this art of encounter that Francis is constantly trying to bring us back to. He says, when we open our hearts to those who are different, this enables them, while continuing to be themselves, to develop in new ways. The different cultures that have flourished over the centuries need to be preserved, lest our world become impoverished. So again, it comes back to protecting as well as integrating, to take those words. When we welcome people in, it's not about you have to become clones of us. There has to be a space within our communities for diversity and for local culture or local traditions to manifest themselves. He says cultures should be open to new experiences through their encounter with other realities. For the risk of succumbing to cultural sclerosis is always present. Now, if we think about culture in a proper way, we know that culture is always dynamic anyway. Culture and cultures are moving, progressing, dynamic. Sometimes you'll hear an argument, an ethical argument about something, and you'll hear people say, well, it's always been our tradition, or it's always been our culture not to do something or to do something, as though culture and tradition is static, as though it is written in stone and it is immovable. But actually understanding culture in the fullest sense suggests that culture and cultures are alive and breathing and dynamic and evolving. And this is very much the picture that Francis is presenting here. And the best changes that occur to cultures occur within cultures. And Francis makes this point also, and it's a very important one. We're not looking at things in a top-down model. So the West will tell the rest of the world how to live or whatever it is. The most sustained and, what would you say, maybe equitable changes that happen within cultures happen within cultures. They're not imposed from without. And that's when meaningful change can actually happen in the best sense. But for this to occur, we need communication. And we're back to a big theme of Francis here in this encyclical. He talks about the importance of communication, the importance of dialogue. It builds trust, he says, and the importance of encounter. And similar, I think, to what Jonathan Sacks was saying in the TED Talk that you looked at, we've nothing to fear from that. If we are confident enough in ourselves, in our identity, in our tradition, in our place, in what it is that we bring to the party, so to speak. If we're confident in that way, we've nothing to fear from other cultures. And very often you find that some of the most reactive groups in society, take groups, your sort of white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys in America and so on, those very reactive, extreme groups, I would say, are probably as extreme as they are because they feel they haven't an identity. They feel they're not rooted. They feel that they're losing something important to them. Whereas for Francis, and what Jonathan Sacks was saying, is when we're confident enough and when we actually understand ourselves and our culture properly, we've nothing to fear from the stranger. We've nothing to fear from those coming in and bringing with them their talents and their stories and their songs. But for all of this to happen, Francis tells us that we need an ethic of generosity. And in the same way that I think it was in our last chapter, we spoke about, one of the points he made was that we need to sort of devise and develop a new ethic of international relations. Again, here you see him moving more to the interiority of the person again. We need an ethic of generosity. That's not something you can impose through legislation, for example. You can make people do certain things, but it won't be out of an ethic of generosity that they're doing it. So that's something we have to cultivate within ourselves and within our communities. And it's a very ancient idea, as we all know. It's a very ancient ethic. We know that within the Judeo-Christian tradition, this ethic of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger, was so important. And we find it in Islam as well, for example. And he says, without fraternal gratuitousness, we becomes a form of frenetic commerce, he says, in which we are constantly weighing up what we give and what we get back in return, God, on the other hand, Francis tells us, gives freely to the point of helping even those who are unfaithful. And we contrast that unconditional love on the part of God with, again, some of the narrowness and the difficulty that we're seeing in our world today. And Francis goes on to say that narrow forms of nationalism are an extreme expression of an inability to grasp the meaning of this ethic of generosity. He says they err in thinking that they can develop on their own, that by closing their doors to others, they will be better protected. So that's the error, if you like, that Francis is trying to steer us away from here. Now, that said, and I don't want to go on for too much longer, but that said, there's a very real tension here between the local and the universal. I was at a conference in Sarajevo a couple of summers ago, and I was listening to an American theologian called Kenneth Himes. He teaches in Boston College. He was giving a paper on the common good and various aspects of it. And it was probably about 3 years ago, because it was shortly after President Trump was elected. And Himes made the important point. He said, Trump, so to speak, didn't fall from the sky. The conditions that allowed him to get elected were there long before he came along, and they'll be there long after he departs office. And it's a very important point because, again, this tension between the local and the universal shouldn't be underestimated, nor should it be kind of flippantly dismissed. These are real tensions in people's lives. Many people who voted for President Trump are not extremists and they're not white supremacists, but they do feel a loss of a sense of identity. And they do feel that the global is taking over, and what is local or peculiar or specific to American culture is being forgotten, and so on. And it's the same kind of thing that helped Brexit get through, and so on and so forth. And these are real human tensions and real human fears. So we have to take them seriously rather than just dismiss it. And Francis does this in chapter 4, and I think it's a really important part of the chapter. He says, we pay attention to the global, to the universal, in order to avoid narrowness and banality. So we need to have an outlook, a global outlook, he says, to save ourselves from petty provincialism. Okay, again, you can think of what Jonathan Sachs was saying in that TED talk. If we surround ourselves by the people who say the very same things as ourselves, we become more extreme in our views, whether it's extreme left or extreme right or whatever it is. So we need others who take us out of ourselves and help us to think differently and think afresh about things. So there needs to be what he calls a local flavor to who we are and how we understand ourselves. And he says, I cannot truly encounter another unless I stand on firm foundations. So again, the same point that Jonathan Sachs was making. If we're confident enough in who we are, we've nothing to fear through meeting new ideas, meeting new people, meeting new cultures. But equally, while we respect and honor and celebrate the local, we need to have a universal horizon, he says. So we need to be able to see beyond ourselves and see far into the distance. And when I was reading this section, I thought of two people in particular. One's a Ghanaian philosopher called Kwame Anthony Appiah. I think I mentioned him to you already. And the other is an Irish theologian called Ethna Regan. She teaches in DCU. Now, Appiah has coined the phrase rooted cosmopolitanism to try to explain this tension. We're rooted, each and every one of us, but we're cosmopolitan. We belong to the cosmos. We belong to what is global and what is bigger. And we have to try to reconcile that and celebrate it and keep it in a healthy balance. Ethna Regan has coined the phrase situated universalism. Now, they're both basically saying the same thing and saying what Francis is getting at here also. But I like Regan's idea of situated universalism. And here's what she has to say in explaining this idea. She says, in proposing the term situated universalism, I am trying to reject the idea of concrete subjectivity. That is, being a subject whose human nature is concretized in terms of race, gender, class, and culture, without allowing any dimension of that concreteness to undermine the inalienable dignity of the human person or to limit that person's rights. So we can make universal claims, and we as Christians do make universal claims. We claim that every human being is made in God's image and that every human being has an innate dignity because of that. That's a universal claim, and it's a big claim to make, and it's an inclusive claim. It includes the murderers, it includes the tax evaders, it includes every, it is inclusive of all of humanity. So it's a universal claim, but within that we are all situated, and our uniqueness needs the room and the space to come out, either as individuals or as groups. And again, this comes back to our Trinitarian model of relationship and our Christian anthropology that's rooted in this Trinitarian model of relationship, that we are unique and specific. And as individuals, as unique beings, we have rights and we have claims, but we are in this mutual reciprocal relationship. We're in this perichoresis, this eternal dance that the three persons of the Trinity are in. In a sense, we're in this eternal dance of life. And that brings with it obligations and claims and responsibilities as well. So it's an important tension to acknowledge between the local and the universal. The person who is subject, who is historical, who belongs to a context, and the universal, which is much bigger than us and that puts much bigger claims on us also. And that tension needs to be, I think, understood and worked out according to time and place. And I'll just leave you with this, I don't know how I am for time. I'll leave you with this quote from Francis from paragraph 148. He says, a healthy openness never threatens one's own identity. For our own cultural identity is strengthened and enriched as a result of dialogue with those unlike ourselves. And he says, he warns us, he says, nor is our authentic identity preserved by an impoverished isolation. So it's a balance, it's a tension. He doesn't offer us the 3 quick steps to how to figure this out. That's for us to do, that's our challenge. But at least if we're aware of that tension and if we keep it in a healthy balance, we can at least then move forward and consider the bigger picture beyond, I suppose, just ourselves.